Nobody anticipated the documentary would unfold in quite this way. At first glance, it seemed like another bold move from 50 Cent, a man whose career has been built on transforming real-life tension into compelling storytelling. To the casual observer, this release could have appeared as just another industry project, a high-profile drop meant to capitalize on curiosity, attention, and hype. Yet beneath the surface, a more intricate strategy was at work. Patterns began emerging. Whispers circulated through social media and fan circles. Reactions were quietly cataloged. And then came the silence. A silence that hip-hop audiences immediately noticed, because in this world, nothing is ever truly quiet. Amid the release, one name began trending alongside the documentary in a way that could not be ignored: T and Boosie Badazz. But it was not the sort of attention born of outright confrontation or headline-grabbing drama. Rather, the tension manifested in subtle, almost imperceptible layers: fleeting comments, quick reactions, sly jabs, and moments that seemed insignificant on their own but carried weight in aggregate. A smirk, a carefully chosen word, or a seemingly offhand remark could ripple across social media, sparking speculation. Fans began connecting these dots, reading between the lines, and suddenly the narrative seemed alive, growing beyond the documentary itself. The earliest sparks of speculation were ignited by the resurfacing of old clips. Moments that once seemed inconsequential or forgotten now appeared loaded with meaning under the lens of hindsight. Interviews, live performances, casual remarks, and cryptic social media posts were revisited, recontextualized, and interpreted in entirely new ways. Questions began circulating. Why now? Timing in hip-hop, particularly when someone like 50 Cent is involved, is rarely accidental. He doesn't simply tell stories, he curates them. He frames events, sequences them, and amplifies them, creating narratives designed to captivate, provoke, and sometimes unsettle. As viewers absorbed the documentary, it became clear that it contained more than just straightforward content. It suggested strategic commentary on the inner workings of the hip-hop industry. Fans speculated that certain artists were being framed in subtly uncomfortable ways, not through direct attacks, but through the deliberate sequencing and emphasis of moments. Were T and Boosie being intentionally positioned in contrast to one another? Were the resurfaced clips chosen to provoke reflection, controversy, or intrigue? These questions spread rapidly across social media, fueling discussion, analysis, and theory building among fans. Understanding why this speculation gained momentum requires a look at the histories of the key figures involved. 50 Cent, beyond his fame as a chart-topping rapper, has transformed into a media architect. Over the past decade, he has successfully navigated television production, executive producing gritty crime dramas, and crafting narratives around street stories in ways few artists can match. He understands control over perception, timing, and narrative. Every project he touches is rarely neutral. Whether music, television, or documentary, his work is deliberate, curated to provoke, illuminate, and sometimes unsettle, keeping audiences invested in both content and conversation. T, in contrast, has long cultivated his image as a Southern hip-hop elder statesman.
You might
He is
want to consider
articulate,
bringing in a crisis PR
opinionated,
team,
and deeply
with many fans
engaged in
debating whether
industry discourse, often weighing in on controversies, aligning with certain artists, and challenging others. His influence extends beyond music. He has positioned himself as a voice of experience, insight, and authority within the hip-hop community. His history of engagement with contentious issues means that his presence in any narrative immediately carries weight and significance. Boosie Badazz enters the story with a markedly different persona: unfiltered, unapologetic, and blunt. Known for speaking candidly without concern for public approval or industry optics, Boosie's commentary often generates headlines precisely because it is raw and authentic. Unlike strategic, image-conscious figures, his words are direct, immediate, and often polarizing. This stark contrast in approach, Boosie's authenticity versus T's strategic voice, creates an intriguing dynamic when both exist within the same cultural narrative. Historically, T and Boosie have had public disagreements, not explosive feuds, but philosophical clashes over loyalty, commentary, and the handling of sensitive situations. Boosie has openly criticized T in the past, particularly regarding statements T made about legal matters affecting other artists. T, in turn, has responded publicly, creating exchanges that, while not sustained over time, left a lingering trace in collective memory. When old tensions are revisited, even subtly, they gain the potential to spark renewed debate. When 50C NT teased the documentary, fans immediately scanned for familiar names. The combination of pre-existing tension and the timing of the release created fertile ground for speculation. In hip-hop, documentaries crafted by influential figures are rarely simple historical records. They reinterpret, frame, and sometimes manipulate events to highlight dynamics that will provoke conversation. Any resurfacing of old disagreements is instantly analyzed for intent, context, and implication. In this case, Boosie's reappearance alongside T and 50 Cent provided the perfect storm for online theories, fan debates, and narrative speculation. Importantly, there is no verified evidence suggesting that T directly influenced the documentary, nor that Boosie was intentionally targeted. Yet, perception in this space does not rely on confirmation. It thrives on possibility. As fans juxtaposed old footage with the new narrative lens, patterns began to emerge. Was this alignment coincidental or deliberate? 50 Cent's reputation for revealing uncomfortable truths and strategic provocations added fuel to these questions. When a documentary presents moments that might cast individuals in a controversial or reflective light, audiences instinctively ask, who benefits, who is being framed, and why now? Adding complexity, the relationship between 50 Cent and T is historically layered. Publicly, they have maintained a respectful tone, but beneath the surface exists a history of competition and overlapping influence. Both are strong personalities, leaders in their respective spheres, and highly conscious of their legacies. Meanwhile, Boosie and 50 Cent share limited collaborative history. The juxtaposition of these dynamics encourages fan speculation, alliances, and the construction of narratives that may extend far beyond what actually occurred. In modern hip-hop, documentary storytelling is inseparable from legacy management. Artists use these projects to preserve perspective, frame context, and shape how history remembers them. With 50 Cent directing the lens, the stakes are amplified. Documentaries no longer simply inform, they frame. And framing is everything. It determines perception, memory, and public conversation. Footage that was contentious or ambiguous years ago can appear deliberate when spotlighted anew. Fans dissect every detail, from live performance reactions to subtle social media cues, connecting dots, constructing meaning, and, inevitably, sparking speculation. The psychological dimension cannot be understated. Audiences are drawn to nuance, to behind-the-scenes strategy, and to tension that is subtle rather than overt. When conflict or discomfort is orchestrated quietly, engagement deepens. Fans become amateur detectives, interpreting motives, analyzing timing, and theorizing about strategic alliances. The documentary's carefully curated sequences encouraged this behavior, creating layers of interpretation that were not immediately obvious but immensely compelling. Ultimately, the documentary did more than present a story. It provoked conversation, invited scrutiny, and challenged audiences to consider what lies beneath the surface. The resurfacing of Boosie in relation to T and 50 Cent was not an accidental spark. It was a convergence of history, personality, timing, and strategic narrative craft. The discussion it generated, though rooted in speculation, reflects the unique ecosystem of hip-hop, a space where perception is as influential as fact, where legacy is constantly curated, and where every gesture, word, and glance can take on enormous meaning. Through it all, 50 Cent demonstrated once again why he is considered a master of narrative strategy in hip-hop. His work highlights that documentaries are not neutral vessels. They are tools for framing, for shaping discourse, and for guiding public attention. For fans, the documentary became less about straightforward storytelling and more about pattern recognition, nuance interpretation, and engagement with a subtle, multi-layered narrative that continues to unfold. In the end, it reaffirmed a truth long understood in hip-hop. Nothing is ever accidental, and everything, even silence, carries weight. Intentionally or not, the recent 50 Cent documentary became a case study in how modern hip-hop culture thrives as much on perception as it does on reality. At first glance, it appeared to be another bold project from a man whose empire is built on transforming real-life tension into captivating narratives. But a closer look revealed a carefully orchestrated interplay of timing, history, and audience psychology. What unfolded was less about overt conflict and more about perception, control, and the subtle choreography of storytelling in the modern hip-hop landscape. The discussion surrounding the documentary is multifaceted. At its core, it's about understanding intent, timing, and control. It's about recognizing how influential figures in the industry manage image, navigate and strategically use media to their advantage. In this instance, the documentary acted as a prism, refracting historical dynamics, revealing understated strategies, and reigniting discussions that had lain dormant for years. By resurfacing these narratives, 50 Cent created a platform where speculation, alliances, and fan interpretation could flourish, without a single direct confrontation appearing on screen. Ultimately, this documentary demonstrates the power of curation and historical framing. It is a masterclass in how narrative construction shapes public perception, how subtle gestures can spark global speculation, and how the intersections of influence, legacy, and strategy can transform a media project into a cultural event. Whether Boosie Badazz, or 50 Cent intended for every interpretation that emerged, the impact lies in the conversation sparked, the imagined alliances, and the narratives debated. In hip-hop, as in storytelling more broadly, timing, framing, and perception often carry as much weight as action itself. As the internet dissected every clip, tweet, and comment, one fact became evident. This documentary was not simply content. It was a conversation starter, a strategic lens on history, and a reminder that in hip-hop, stories are rarely finished. Timing is deliberate, perception is everything, and legacy is the ultimate prize. Fans weren't just observing a film. They were witnessing the calculated intersection of power, influence, and narrative mastery. In hip-hop, timing, perception, and subtlety often matter far more than overt conflict. That is precisely what the 50 Cent documentary illustrated. Initially, it seemed like a routine project from a figure whose career is defined by transforming real-life tension into engaging narratives. Yet what distinguishes 50 Cent is not simply his storytelling ability. It is his role as curator. He selects moments, sequences them, and amplifies them in ways that few other artists can match. Curiosity quickly evolved into speculation. One name began trending in relation to the documentary, Boosie Badazz, not because of a headline feud or public diss, but because subtle patterns hinted at narrative intention. A smirk, a resurfaced clip, a carefully timed line, each fragment seemed to suggest a deeper calculation. Fans began connecting the dots, analyzing motivations, and theorizing about
Post,
implications.
he suggested that T
In
might face
hip-hop,
questions about
perception
reported
can
legal
be as
allegations that have been
influential
discussed
as
publicly,
reality,
and he
and this documentary became the perfect example of that principle in action. The story's foundation lay in resurfaced old clips. Interviews, social media posts, and candid moments from years prior reemerged in the public sphere, reframed by the documentary's narrative lens. Boosie, celebrated for his unfiltered authenticity, suddenly appeared in a new context where his candor was scrutinized for potential implications. Audiences asked, "Why now? What is the purpose of resurfacing these moments?" Who stands to benefit? These questions underpin the surge of speculation, even in the absence of direct evidence. It is here that the strategy behind 50 Cent's approach becomes clear. He has long understood that controversy draws attention, but sustained ambiguity deepens engagement. A diss track announces itself. A subtle narrative shift invites debate. When fans noticed clips of Boosie that seemed uncomfortable, it did not necessarily mean he had been humiliated, but perception immediately took center stage. Conversation thrives on ambiguity, and the documentary expertly exploited that principle. Three key figures formed the core of this unfolding narrative: a media-savvy mogul controlling the documentary lens, a veteran figure with a history of philosophical clashes, and an unfiltered artist whose commentary routinely generates headlines. Combined with timing, historical context, and social media amplification, the story practically wrote itself. When old tension meets new media platforms, escalation becomes almost inevitable. What propelled the discussion further was its basis in perception rather than verification. No private footage confirmed collusion. No behind-the-scenes coordination was publicly documented. Yet hip-hop culture thrives on perceived alliances and suggested motives. When influential figures appear to interact, even indirectly, the audience instinctively fills in the blanks. A single line in a promotional teaser referencing how public words define an individual was enough to ignite speculation. Fans immediately linked it to Boosie's past high-profile interviews. The documentary thus evolved from a collection of resurfaced clips into a broader commentary on consequence and narrative framing. In hip-hop, reputation is a form of currency. When past statements are reframed and perceived intentions shift, public sympathy, critique, and cultural memory can all be subtly realigned. Fans debated both philosophy and footage. Supporters of Boosie argued that authenticity should not be mistaken for recklessness, while others maintained that candor carries inherent responsibility. The conversation was never about humiliation. It was about strategic positioning and the control of narrative. T's involvement, or rather his historical presence, added another layer of complexity. T and Boosie have had disagreements in the past, rooted in philosophical clashes over industry ethics, loyalty, and commentary. While these disputes were neither explosive nor sustained, they were public enough to remain in collective memory. When old tension intersects with a new narrative lens, speculation is almost automatic. Is T subtly influencing perception? Are Boosie's past actions being reframed? Or are fans simply weaving unrelated threads into a new storyline? Silence became another tool in this dynamic. Neither T nor Boosie publicly addressed the circulating theories. In hip-hop, silence can be louder than denial. False stories are often shut down outright, but ambiguity invites analysis, speculation, and anticipation. Meanwhile, 50 Cent did what he does best: tease, hint, and provoke. Promotional captions, cryptic lines, and carefully timed reveals kept fans engaged without any overt statements. The result was a masterclass in subtle marketing, discussion generated organically, without any overt expenditure. Speculation extended beyond fans to industry commentators and media outlets. Analysts debated motivations, possible alliances, and potential implications for reputations. What might have been dismissed as gossip became a study in audience psychology, media strategy, and narrative influence. Every promotional clip, social media post, and resurfaced interview became fodder for discussion. The documentary, by design or accident, highlighted the power of perception in shaping cultural conversation. From Boosie's perspective, this environment could be disorienting, even if no ill intent existed. Old clips trending again, fan debates over interpretation, and association with a project beyond his control create a subtle tension. When you do not control the edit, you cannot control perception. Often, these nuances are more consequential than any overt public feud. A pivotal moment occurred when a fan asked Boosie about the documentary during a live appearance. He responded calmly but knowingly. That single, understated sentence carried weight. It acknowledged the storytelling process and the multiple ways history can be interpreted. That moment alone fueled engagement, as fans dissected his words, debated implications, and multiplied online discussion. At this stage, the narrative had shifted from simple curiosity to strategic positioning. Conversation was no longer about clips alone, it became about legacy and influence. Who would frame history? Whose perspective would dominate cultural memory? In hip-hop, legacy is permanent. Every debate, reinterpretation, and discussion shapes the public perception of an artist's narrative. The documentary's impact demonstrates a broader lesson about modern hip-hop storytelling. Perception, timing, and narrative control can transform a seemingly ordinary project into a cultural phenomenon. Even without explicit confrontation, engagement escalates. If the documentary highlighted pointed moments, it would provoke discussion. If it did not, the speculation alone achieved the same effect. Either outcome reinforced the documentary's success as a vehicle for cultural engagement and strategic discourse. Audiences in this instance were no longer passive viewers, they were active interpreters. They assessed intent, evaluated historical relationships, and speculated about alliances. Each subtle gesture, cryptic line, or carefully framed sequence was magnified through collective interpretation. What could have been a straightforward documentary became a study in perception, influence, and cultural dynamics, a case study in how hip-hop thrives on storytelling, ambiguity, and legacy management. In the end, the documentary illustrated the interplay of timing, historical context, and strategic curation in modern hip-hop. 50 Cent does more than release content. He orchestrates engagement. Historical relationships provide context. Social media accelerates dissemination, and fans, journalists, and commentators become participants in an ongoing narrative experiment. Even without direct confrontation, subtle narrative control creates ripple effects that can define perception for years. This documentary is a lesson
time,
in
King of the
power,
South,
influence,
artist
and
Moneybagg
narrative
Yo,
mastery.
also did interviews
It shows
discussing
that
the
in
Miss Jackson
hip-hop,
record,
perception
explaining
often
his
outweighs
perspective on how
reality. Subtlety can be more consequential than aggression, and timing can dictate cultural relevance. Audiences are not merely consumers, they are collaborators in the interpretation of legacy. Every gesture, line, or clip contributes to an evolving story. The documentary proves that the story is never finished. It is a reminder that in hip-hop, as in life, framing matters, perception is. King and legacy is the ultimate prize. The tension surrounding the recent 50 Cent documentary illustrates how modern hip-hop culture thrives as much on perception as it does on reality. At first glance, the documentary appeared to be another ambitious project from a man who has built an empire by transforming real-life tension into compelling narratives. But beneath the surface, it became something far more intricate, a masterclass in narrative control, perception management, and audience engagement. The story that unfolded was less about overt conflict and more about timing, framing, and the subtle orchestration of tension in the digital age. Unlike earlier eras, where disputes in hip-hop were primarily resolved through interviews, diss tracks, or public confrontations, the digital age allows for a more nuanced approach. Now, timing, editing, and narrative framing can provoke debate without a single overt confrontation. The 50 Cent documentary, whether intentionally or not, leveraged these dynamics perfectly. Every fan theory, every discussion thread, and every resurfaced clip became part of the unfolding story. The documentary operated as a catalyst, allowing audiences to observe and interpret events as they connected with history, media, and the personalities involved. By reframing old content, highlighting specific moments, and leaving room for ambiguity, the documentary emphasized the strategic dimension of modern hip-hop media. In this landscape, audience perception drives engagement. When perception is allowed to evolve organically, speculation becomes the engine of the narrative. The documentary exemplified this principle. The more ambiguous the situation, the more compelling the story became. Subtlety, long undervalued in traditional storytelling, emerged as a critical tool. This is not merely a story about resurfaced interviews or potential embarrassment. At its core, it is about control. Control over narrative, control over legacy, and control over perception. Those who frame history ultimately shape cultural memory. The project showed that even indirect, subtle narrative maneuvers can have enormous impact. For Boosie Badazz, T, and 50 Cent, the documentary became a lens through which fans observed strategy, history, and influence simultaneously in action. The cumulative effect was remarkable. Old clips were revisited, historical disagreements recontextualized, and speculation transformed into public dialogue. Fans debated not only the content itself, but also the philosophies it represented: authenticity versus image management, raw honesty versus calculated framing. In this environment, direct confrontation became almost secondary to the larger narrative of positioning and legacy control. What mattered most was perception, how moments were interpreted, framed, and remembered. From the outset, the rollout of the documentary suggested precision in timing and curation. At first, whispers began circulating across social media. Observers noted the resurfacing of old interviews, clips, and social media posts, and a pattern slowly emerged. One name in particular began trending in connection with the project: Boosie Badazz, not due to a direct feud or headline-grabbing confrontation, but because subtle cues suggested history might be reframed in a new light. Fans quickly began dissecting old interviews, social media content, and resurfaced moments, asking why these specific clips were gaining traction now. In hip-hop, timing is rarely coincidental. 50 Cent has built an empire on the understanding that perception drives conversation. He doesn't just tell stories, he curates them, selecting moments, framing them, and amplifying tension with a precision few artists can match. A loud diss track announces itself immediately, but subtle narrative shifts, executed strategically, are far more enduring. They encourage speculation, debate, and engagement, leaving the audience actively involved in shaping the story. The resurfacing of old clips featuring Boosie speaking candidly about controversial subjects highlighted this dynamic. Moments once celebrated as authenticity were now scrutinized under a new lens. Raw honesty became interpreted as recklessness. Unfiltered commentary became a potential liability. Audiences began to ask, why now? What is the intention behind resurfacing these moments? And most importantly, who benefits from this framing? In the digital era, the audience is empowered to contextualize, reframe, and analyze every nuance of narrative, turning perception into a cultural force. Layered into this dynamic was T, another influential figure in the conversation. T and Boosie have a history of public disagreements, philosophical clashes over loyalty, industry ethics, and commentary on sensitive events. While these interactions never erupted into explosive feuds, they were widely noted, debated, and remembered by fans. With the documentary teasing themes of loyalty, reputation, and narrative contour, all audiences naturally interpreted these past tensions through the lens of current content. Subtext became the battlefield. Even the mere suggestion of alignment or strategic framing between 50 Cent and T, whether real or perceived, was enough to ignite speculation. What made this scenario even more compelling is that there was no verified proof of secret alliances, no private material exchanged, and no confirmed orchestration behind the scenes. Yet the possibility of coordinated narrative influence generated sufficient tension to dominate public attention. Unlike social media posts that disappear, deleted tweets, or fleeting moments on Instagram Live, a documentary is permanent. It exists as a reference point in streaming libraries for years, becoming a lasting part of cultural memory. For artists like Boosie, whose brand is rooted in unfiltered honesty, even the suggestion that their statements might be reframed or reinterpreted can feel threatening. Legacy is, after all, a core commodity in hip-hop culture. Escalation intensified as promotional teasers began to drop. One line referenced how public words can come back to define you, while another alluded to loyalty shifting when the cameras turn off. Neither named individuals explicitly, but fans immediately linked the references to Boosie's history of outspoken interviews and prior interactions with T. What had started as casual curiosity evolved into a broader debate. How might these clips influence public perception? How could they reshape understanding of past conflicts for younger audiences unfamiliar with the original context? The psychological dynamics of the situation were equally fascinating. Fans mobilized to defend Boosie preemptively. Supporters highlighted his history of honesty, authenticity, and transparency, arguing that anything else was a misinterpretation rather than an attack. Critics countered that public words carry weight, and that context alone cannot erase potential consequences. The conversation transcended the footage itself, evolving into a discourse on accountability, philosophy, and ethics. It wasn't just about clips. It was about legacy, perception, and the morality of narrative framing in contemporary hip-hop. Both T and Boosie maintained strategic silence throughout. In hip-hop, silence often speaks louder than denial. False narratives are typically shut down immediately, but ambiguity allows speculation to thrive, builds suspense, and ensures continued engagement. 50 Cent, true to his mastery of the medium, continued to tease the documentary through cryptic captions, promotional lines, and carefully timed releases. He never directly addressed names, yet his subtle cues ensured the conversation continued to grow organically. As speculation escalated, podcasts, fan pages, and social media threads dissected every nuance. Side-by-side comparisons of T, Boosie, and 50 Cent circulated online, often accompanied by captions like "Who controls the narrative?" or "Legacy or liability?" Discussion shifted from potential embarrassment to strategic narrative control. In an era where documentaries shape cultural memory, controlling the story has become more valuable than immediate controversy. The documentary illustrated this principle flawlessly. Its power did not lie in shocking revelations or overt conflict, but in interpretation. Old clips, when juxtaposed with new commentary, emotional beats, or curated context, could subtly alter public perception. Boosie's past statements, once celebrated for candor, now carried a different weight when presented alongside lines emphasizing loyalty, consequence, or perspective. Even neutral editing could influence how audiences interpreted tone, intention, and personality. 50 Cent understands this deeply. His documentaries are not mere recordings. They are framing devices, amplifiers of tension, and instruments of strategic positioning. Fan reactions underscored the intensity of this dynamic. Boosie's supporters reposted clips in full, guarding against selective editing. Viral tweets cautioned against taking snippets out of context, emphasizing the importance of seeing the complete picture. Meanwhile, neutral observers began asking bigger questions. Has hip-hop entered an era where storytelling through documentaries has overtaken traditional diss tracks as the medium of conflict? Historically, rivalries played out in music. Now they can be shaped through editing, narrative sequencing, and strategic release. This shift marks a new chapter in cultural storytelling. As conversations broadened, industry analysts, brand managers, and cultural commentators joined the debate. The narrative evolved from gossip into a study of strategy, influence, and legacy management. The documentary was not simply a compilation of old content. It was a vehicle for guiding interpretation, shaping emotional response, and influencing memory. By spotlighting certain clips, emphasizing specific narratives, and maintaining ambiguity, the project transformed speculation into a calculated engagement engine. Boosie's public appearances added nuance to the unfolding story. When asked about the documentary during a live session, he did not explode or make accusations. Instead, he said, "I ain't worried about nobody telling stories. I lived mine." That single statement carried immense weight. It subtly acknowledged the storytelling process and the possibility of multiple interpretations of history. Yet it also amplified intrigue. As fans, commentators, and industry insiders dissected every word, gesture, and implication. By the time audiences had fully engaged, the documentary had already achieved its goals. Conversation was sparked, speculation flourished, and discussions about legacy and narrative positioning dominated cultural discourse. No explicit accusations, feuds, or confrontations were necessary. Fans were not merely passive viewers. They became active participants in a multi-layered cultural dialogue where perception became reality, history was curated, and influence was exercised with precision. Ultimately, the unfolding scenario around Boosie, T, and 50 Cent demonstrates the nuanced mechanics of modern hip-hop storytelling. Timing is everything. Narrative framing is crucial, and audience perception is the ultimate arbiter. Subtlety, strategy, and historical context can provoke far more engagement than loud, public conflict ever could. By teasing context, resurfacing old clips, and allowing ambiguity to thrive, the documentary proved that careful narrative curation is a form of cultural power. In modern hip-hop, perception, timing, and subtle narrative control often matter more than open conflict. 50 Cent's documentary illustrated this principle with unparalleled precision. At first glance, it appeared as a standard industry
Artist Moneybagg
project,
Yo
a
also did
cinematic
interviews discussing the Miss
exploration of
Jackson
tension
record,
within hip-hop.
explaining his
But as
perspective
the
on how
rollout unfolded, it became evident that this was no ordinary release. From initial whispers to trending names and resurfaced content, the documentary highlighted the ways strategic ambiguity, curated historical context, and digital engagement intersect to produce cultural influence. By the end, what might have been dismissed as simple media consumption became an interactive experience. Fans debated, analyzed, and interpreted. Discussions about authenticity, image, consequence, and loyalty dominated social feeds. The documentary had transcended its role as content. It became a lens through which audiences examined power, influence, and narrative in contemporary hip-hop. History had been reframed, perception had been manipulated, and engagement had been achieved, not through confrontation, but through strategy, subtlety, and timing. The tension surrounding the recent 50 Cent documentary illustrates how modern hip-hop thrives as much on perception as reality. At first glance, the project appeared to be another cinematic exploration of real-life tensions, yet it quickly evolved into a case study in narrative strategy, timing, and audience engagement. What unfolded was not about overt conflict, but about subtle orchestration, how old clips, calculated ambiguity, and digital platforms can transform perception into cultural conversation. Every gesture, line, and pause became significant. Fans and commentators scrutinized Boosie Badazz, T, and 50 Cent with near-microscopic attention, interpreting meaning in silences, reactions, and promotional teasers. Meanwhile, 50 Cent continued the rollout without naming anyone directly. T remained publicly unbothered, while Boosie's measured responses suggested confidence. In media, sometimes not reacting creates more speculation than responding ever could. Each pause, tease, and ambiguous line became material for interpretation, allowing the narrative to flourish organically. By this stage, the discussion had outgrown gossip blogs. Conversations migrated to podcasts, Twitter Spaces, fan forums, and even marketing panels. When names like 50 Cent, T, and Boosie are linked, even speculatively, the spotlight expands beyond fans. Industry insiders, brand strategists, and cultural commentators all engage. The question evolves from, is embarrassing footage out there, to what does this documentary represent? How does it shape storytelling, perception, and legacy? Documentaries are inherently power plays. They do more than capture culture. They preserve, frame, and influence how it is remembered. When 50 Cent produces a project, it becomes part of the hip-hop archive, a timestamp and reference point that endures for years. For artists like Boosie, whose brand relies on authenticity. Even the idea that past statements could be reframed carries significance. Every editorial choice, the clips highlighted, the lines emphasized, the moments left ambiguous, contributes to cultural memory. The conversation extended beyond speculation to broader ethical debates. Fans questioned whether it was fair to spotlight Conter over statements without updated context. Was it archival honesty, strategic framing, or something in between? These discussions reflected how modern hip-hop media operates, through selective storytelling, timing, and curated narrative. Neutral observers also noted the cultural implications. Are artists now competing through narrative control rather than traditional musical conflict? A documentary can influence perception, shape interpretation, and guide audience emotion, making it as potent as a chart-topping track. Unlike ephemeral social media posts, documentaries endure, creating a lasting impact. The result was a multi-layered narrative ecosystem. Audiences were no longer passive consumers. They became active participants, interpreting meaning, debating intent, and co-creating the story. Each micro-gesture, cryptic line, and carefully chosen clip added to a narrative shaped collaboratively by artists, media, and fans. By the time the documentary even aired, ripple effects were already in motion. Conversations, speculation, and debates had spread across communities, podcasts, and social platforms. Ultimately, this scenario illustrates the mechanics of modern hip-hop media. Timing is crucial, framing is essential, and audience perception is paramount. Ambiguity, resurfaced content, and historical tension combined to create an ecosystem where speculation and interpretation drove engagement. Every teaser, every line, every public response contributed to a larger story about legacy, control, and perception. Even before the release, the narrative had been carefully orchestrated. Early teasers and resurfaced clips hinted at tension without confirming conflict. Fans noticed patterns. Boosie's candid statements from years prior teased philosophical clashes with Boosie and 50 Cent's subtle framing. These cues created a sense of anticipation. Raw honesty became subject to reinterpretation. Moments once celebrated as authenticity were now scrutinized, with audiences asking, why now? Who benefits? What does it mean for legacy? T's silence became a narrative tool in itself. Known for articulate public statements, his absence sparked curiosity and speculation. Was he deliberately avoiding the conversation, or was the internet projecting alliances where none existed? Meanwhile, Boosie's confident approach neutralized potential humiliation. By remaining composed and reaffirming his authenticity, the narrative shifted from embarrassment to strategic positioning. Humiliation requires visible discomfort. In its absence, control and reputation become the focus. The discussion evolved from drama to philosophy. Commentators debated whether documentaries should reopen past conflicts and the ethics of highlighting old statements without context. These debates reflected generational divides. Older fans emphasized nuance and historical context, while younger audiences prioritized impact and consequence. Documentaries, sitting at the intersection of memory and media, challenge assumptions, provoke discussion, and invite reflection on cultural responsibility. Audience psychology amplified the narrative. The rollout was treated like a chess match. Every teaser, cryptic caption, and pause was analyzed as a calculated move. Speculation fueled engagement, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of attention. The rumor about resurfaced clips was no longer about embarrassment. It became about narrative tension, imagined alliances, and industry strategy. The story was compelling not because it revealed secrets, but because it positioned perception as the battleground. The focus shifted from humiliation to legacy. Discussions centered on how narrative control shapes public memory. Audiences debated authenticity versus framing, image management versus transparency. Legacy is permanent. Once it enters the conversation, stakes rise. Artists and producers are engaged not just in storytelling but in cultural preservation, defending reputation, and guiding interpretation for current and future audiences. Notably, the documentary hadn't aired, and there was no confirmation of strategic editing or embarrassing content. Yet speculation alone shaped perception. If clips were included neutrally, the hype became a lesson in audience engagement. If particular moments were highlighted, the narrative shifted again, reinforcing 50 Cent's mastery of attention. From a marketing perspective, this is simple math. Attention drives engagement, engagement drives viewership, and viewership drives cultural relevance. Fans reacted in nuanced ways. Supporters of Boosie emphasized fairness and context, while others debated the line between storytelling and framing. Framing emerged as the central variable. Tone determines emotion, emotion shapes perception, and perception drives narrative. The cultural conversation was fueled not by confrontation but by subtle cues, context, and interpretation. Even without a public feud, direct confrontation or formal accusations, the scenario felt intense. Historical context provided friction, plausibility drove virality, and anticipation shaped the lens through which the documentary would be received. Every teaser, clip, and cryptic line gained significance because audiences were primed to seek meaning, speculate, and debate. When the full trailer was released, intensity
You might want to
peaked.
consider bringing in a
Archival
crisis
footage,
PR team,
commentary
with many
from
fans
multiple
debating whether
eras, and interviews with outspoken artists created a broader narrative than many fans expected. Because speculation had already focused on Boosie, his appearances carried disproportionate weight. Audience perception was guided by anticipation, and every editorial choice was magnified. The result was a documentary that functioned as both content and cultural experiment, a strategic exercise in perception, engagement, and legacy management. In conclusion, the unfolding dynamics surrounding 50 Cent, T, and Boosie Badazz illustrate the power of subtlety, timing, and strategy in modern hip-hop storytelling. This isn't simply about resurfaced clips or potential embarrassment. It's about controlling narrative, shaping cultural memory, and positioning legacy. By creating ambiguity, leveraging historical tension, and allowing audiences to interpret, debate, and speculate, the documentary became a living narrative experiment. Quiet, calculated moves, carefully timed, contextually framed, and strategically teased, can wield more influence than overt feuds, diss tracks, or viral controversies. In hip-hop, where stories are currency and perception is power, this documentary demonstrates the enduring value of narrative mastery. Every pause, every cryptic caption, every subtle editorial choice contributes to a cultural dialogue where engagement, interpretation, and legacy intersect. What may appear to outsiders as simple media content is, in reality, a masterclass in strategic storytelling, audience psychology, and cultural influence. The recent 50 Cent documentary serves as a masterclass in modern media strategy, highlighting how perception, timing, and narrative control can be more influential than overt confrontation. Rather than relying on public feuds or explosive diss tracks, the project demonstrates how framing, anticipation, and audience interpretation can shape cultural conversation and influence legacy. In today's hip-hop ecosystem, influence extends far beyond music. It resides in the subtle orchestration of narrative, context, and perception. For 50 Cent, T, and Boosie Badazz, the stakes were high, but the approach was understated. Strategic silence, measured composure, and carefully curated messaging allowed each party to maintain control while simultaneously fueling discussion. Every teaser, cryptic caption, and resurfaced clip became part of a participatory narrative ecosystem. Fans defended, analyzed, and debated, turning speculation into engagement and amplifying the project's impact even before its official release. In this environment, attention itself became currency, and speculation transformed into strategy. The documentary illustrates how modern hip-hop storytelling operates on multiple levels. Clips that were once considered candid or authentic were reframed under a new context, prompting audiences to reinterpret past statements. Historical tensions between T and Boosie were resurfaced subtly, encouraging analysis of loyalty, ethics, and narrative alignment. By allowing ambiguity to thrive, the project created a space where interpretation, debate, and speculation became central to the experience. Audience engagement shifted from mere consumption to active participation, with fans co-creating meaning and shaping the discourse around the documentary. Beyond speculation, the project highlights the power of narrative control. Legacy is no longer shaped solely by music or public behavior. It is curated through timing, context, and subtle framing. The documentary positioned 50 Cent as both storyteller and orchestrator, illustrating that perception can be as powerful as action. Boosie's measured responses and T's silence further reinforced this dynamic, showing that composure and restraint can signal control, deflect potential humiliation, and even heighten intrigue. Every pause, gesture, and carefully chosen clip contributed to a larger narrative about influence and reputation. Ultimately, this rollout reveals a new paradigm in hip-hop media. Success is no longer defined by who can create the loudest drama, but by who can shape how that drama is perceived. Narrative framing, audience priming, and strategic ambiguity have become tools as potent as any hit record or viral moment. By carefully curating context, controlling subtext, and leveraging historical dynamics, a single documentary can redefine public memory, drive engagement, and influence legacy. The genius of the project lies in its subtlety. By priming audiences, encouraging speculation, and orchestrating cues without direct confrontation, the documentary became more than content. It became an event, a cultural touchstone, and a demonstration of modern media literacy in hip-hop. The lesson is clear. In contemporary storytelling, perception is power, ambiguity is influence, and strategic narrative control can be more decisive than any overt act. 50 Cent's approach shows that the unseen, the psychologically calibrated, and the contextually framed often carry the greatest cultural weight.